The moon, our closest celestial neighbor. As it orbits the Earth, it exerts an irresistible force that causes oceans to gravitate in its direction. To many, the full moon is a beacon of evil, a call to madness. Killers and strange beasts are said to lurk in the shadows cast by its eerie glow. For decades, Hollywood films have shown werewolves caught in the full moon's light, transformed from man to beast. Inspiring poets and murderers alike, the moon grips our imaginations. Its power, forever one of mankind's most enduring enigmas.
Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. In this program, a look at how the full moon tugs at the oceans, causes the Earth to flex, and influences our very minds in mysterious and sometimes sinister ways. First, we'll visit a hospital emergency room on the night of a full moon, where stories of moon madness and real tragic events collide. Then a geologist who predicted the San Francisco quake of 1989 by studying the phases of the moon and peculiar animal behavior. And finally, we'll examine the story of a man from the 17th century who claimed a werewolf ritual made him a murderer and a cannibal. Does the moon truly influence our lives in a way that is beyond our control? Or is it just a primal myth that will remain unexplained?
The connection between the moon and the dark side of human nature is more than a relic of ancient mythology. It's kept alive by contemporary stories, anecdotes shared by police and emergency room doctors and nurses whose shifts have fallen on nights of the full moon. As night fell and the full moon rose on December 3rd, 1998, the staff at the Jackson Trauma Center in Miami braced itself for the night ahead. As Florida's busiest emergency room, it's equipped to handle high volume. But the men and women who work here can never anticipate the extent of the lunacy a full moon will usher in. On this night, the turmoil began before 6 o'clock.
We immediately received 2 victims of gunshot wounds from a couple miles apart, happening at virtually the same time. And while they were being wheeled in, we had a rollover accident where the gentleman was ejected from the vehicle.
3 trauma teams leapt into action. One removed 5 bullets from the victim of a drive-by shooting. Another prepped the driver of a near-fatal car collision for surgery. And the third stabilized a man with a gunshot wound, the result of domestic violence. By 7 p.m., everything was under control, and an eerie stillness descended on the trauma center. During the lull in activity, the staff wondered if this night would rival the legendary nights of past full moons. One nurse remembered a bizarre incident when a walk-in patient complained of a splitting headache.
Watching him and examining him, he had a baseball cap on. And I noticed there was some thread coming out, but there was no writing in that area, so I asked him to remove his hat. He had a bullet into the brain, into the middle of the brain. I brought him back to the trauma area, and he was not only totally neurologically intact, but he survived a surgery and was cleaned and discharged.
People do some very wild and crazy things during normal days, but a full moon definitely does bring out the psychos, or the, maybe not the psychos is the appropriate term, but people who are a little bit unusual, shall we say.
Staffers say a full moon practically guarantees chaos. On another night, an angry walk-in patient began pounding on the nurse's station, demanding attention.
Anybody, please.
He got very agitated at me, and I said, but I'm here to help you, man. I'm listening. I'm stopping everything I'm doing. What can I do for you? And he said, take this out. And he turned around, and there was a hatchet blade sitting between his shoulders, the middle of his back, to which I gladly helped him with a full team of doctors.
7:15 p.m., and the emergency room was still quiet, but not for long. Across town at the Parkway Regional Medical Center, another full moon trauma was just unfolding. Shortly before 7:30 p.m., 39-year-old Dr. Christina Smith was making her evening rounds on Parkway's locked psychiatric ward. One of her patients was 63-year-old Nolis Sterling. Sterling had a long history of violent behavior and had been diagnosed as paranoid and delusional. Recently, he had stopped taking his medication, and his behavior had become threatening. A Florida court sent him to Parkway for 5 days of observation. Sterling told Dr. Smith that he wanted to go home.
A dog to take care of. My business is not functioning.
Dr. Smith explained that he had 2 more days before he could leave. Distraught, Sterling returned to his room and grabbed a gun, which he had been hiding for 3 days. He rushed toward the nurse's station, weapon in hand, and started shouting at Dr. Smith.
I told you I want to go home.
She tried to reason with him, but Sterling wouldn't listen. He fired 2 shots, hitting her in the chest and side. 2 counselors in the next room heard the shots and tried to stop him from fleeing. Dr. Smith lay crumpled on the floor, bleeding. At that moment, a police officer was coming up the elevator, escorting another patient into the hospital. The officer rushed over and managed to handcuff Sterling. Back at the Jackson Trauma Center, a police scanner alerted the staff to the shooting.
We got another GSW coming. Did you hear that?
Yes, sir.
There's another gunshot wound coming.
That's good. We are.
Air rescue is going out to pick up the GSW.
The staff was alerted to be ready for the arrival of critically wounded Dr. Smith. Within minutes, a helicopter carrying the victim flew towards Jackson Hospital, where its trauma team awaited the sound of chopper blades. The staff cautiously approached the helicopter as the blades began to slow down. Dr. Smith was in full cardiac arrest. The medevac team continued chest compressions and life support as they rushed her down to the trauma center. At that point, the Jackson team took over. Frantically, they applied every technique in their medical arsenal to save Dr. Smith's life, but she was not responding. At 8:21 p.m., as the full moon arched across the sky, Dr. Smith's heart rate flatlined, and a promising young doctor lost her battle for life. Are there more crimes and murders committed on nights of a full moon? Does the moon actually influence criminal behavior?
When I was a medical student during my tour on the psychiatric service, I noticed that there were periods of upheaval on the mental wards. Later during services in the emergency room, I found that there were similar periods of upheaval, and that the staff there also attributed these outbursts to times of full moon.
In 1972, Dr. Arnold Lieber decided to find out if there really was a correlation between the phases of the moon and reports of violence. His research took him to the Dade County Medical Examiner's Office in Miami. Dr. Lieber studied 15 years of data, over 1,500 homicides. He began to see a definite pattern. The homicide rate peaked at the full moon and the new moon, when ocean tides were high. Dr. Lieber hypothesized that violent behavior might be triggered by minute changes in fluid pressure, as the moon's pull exerted an influence on the water in the human body. After all, our bodies are 80% water.
If the gravitational pull of the moon can affect the water on planet Earth, perhaps it could also affect the water in planet Man, if you will.
Dr. Lieber's studies have always been considered controversial, and subsequent research contradicted his findings.
There was an article that came out in 1996, 2 years ago, in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine that showed pretty definitively that there was no difference between full moon nights and any other night of the month. It was about 150,000 patients over a 4-year period, very extensive numbers, and again, they showed absolutely no difference in emergency room visits, actually, during that 4-year period on full moon nights.
Dr. Lieber now concedes that these more recent reports suggest that his earlier research may have been inconclusive.
If you look at the whole body of data over a long period of time, it looks as if nothing much is happening.
Despite these findings, the long-standing connection between crime and the full moon is not just myth. Prior to the advent of electricity, a full moon could illuminate the pitch-dark night and give criminals the upper hand in a violent struggle.
This is where we got the story of the murderer's moon. If you're going out to attack someone, it's easier if you don't have one hand taken up with a lantern. You know, you need your hands to attack. And these crimes, by the way, are typically done with bare hands or with a knife.
The modern times make these stories seem archaic. The moon is still thought to possess incredible powers. Next, a California geologist claims there is a direct link between the full moon and earthquakes.
The Unexplained will return on A&E. We now return to The Unexplained on A&E.
There are many myths about the moon's influence on human behavior, but some people claim that the moon possesses an even greater power, the ability to shake the earth under our feet. On October 17th, 1989, 60,000 people packed into San Francisco's Candlestick Park for a World Series game between the Giants and the Oakland A's. Just before the game at 5:04 p.m., a quake with a 7.0 magnitude hit the Bay Area. A part of the Bay Bridge collapsed. The Marina District exploded in flames, and water mains burst throughout the city, hampering firefighters. Nearly 4,000 people were injured, and a total of 68 people were killed in the quake zone. The death toll might have been even higher if so many people hadn't been in the stadium or at home watching the game on television. The Bay Area was caught off guard, and its 6.5 million inhabitants were stunned. There were no apparent warning signs. At least one man, however, says he knew it was going to happen.
And can't support earthquakes.
Jim Birkeland predicted in early October that a quake would hit the Bay Area later that month. The former Sonoma County geologist believes that earthquakes can be triggered by the moon. His controversial theories are based on proven science. The gravitational pull of the moon does cause ocean tides. Birkeland believes these tides can trigger earthquakes. Other scientists do not agree with Birkeland, but that hasn't deterred him in the slightest. He claims that since 1974, he has successfully predicted 300 earthquakes. It's been a long and lonely struggle to prove his point. After experiencing 6 earthquakes in the Bay Area in 1973, he never dreamed he would someday be predicting them.
But on January 8th of that next year, in 1974, there was an article in the paper about how we were in risk of having extremely high tides and possible coastal flooding due to an unusual astronomical alignment.
Birkeland immediately went to an almanac and found that this January 8th alignment included a couple of tide-raising events. The moon would be full, and it would also be at its closest approach to the Earth. Birkeland concluded that a quake might result from the stress caused by this alignment. He researched 6 recent quakes in the San Francisco area, quakes with a magnitude over 3.5 on the Richter scale.
I looked at the dates of these earthquakes. They all fit. They all came from day 1 to day 6 after the new or full moon.
Based on this research, Jim Birkeland presented his first earthquake prediction to his colleagues at the Sonoma County office on January 8, 1974. He told them that there would be an earthquake between the 8th and the 16th of that month.
2 days later, a 4.4 hit. And I thought, this is really simple. What is so tough about predicting earthquakes? Well, let's see. We have a similar period coming up in February, and that one hit.
Birkeland was exhilarated by the accuracy of his predictions. On November 27th of that same year, there was a meeting of the U.S. Geological Survey's Pick and Hammer Club. Birkeland prepared documents for the upcoming conference.
I quickly put together a table showing how the quakes have been occurring at these times and made a prediction that we would have a 3.5 to 5.5 magnitude quake within the next week due to this eclipse of the moon.
The November 27th meeting ran late, and Birkeland was not able to present his prediction to the Pick and Hammer Club that night.
The moderator, president, came over and said, Jim, we'll catch you next month. I said, just give me 5 minutes. This is really hot. No, I'm sorry. So I did not get to present my theory, but I did hand out 10 copies of my Xeroxed prediction.
The next day, Thanksgiving, November 28th, Jim Birkeland's predicted earthquake hit. It was the day of the lunar eclipse.
The 5.2 magnitude quake came rolling through Santa Clara Valley and felt in San Francisco and all around it.
Birkeland's research identified what he terms seismic windows, windows of opportunity when the likelihood of an earthquake becomes extremely high. He claims these seismic windows open on the full moon and remain open for 8 days until the moon begins its swing out of alignment with the Earth again. Jim Birkeland began using his moon theory to make predictions which were published regularly in Bay Area newspapers. Birkeland found in those same newspapers what he claims was another source of prediction data: classified ads for lost pets. He noticed that in the days just before a major earthquake, dogs and cats in the quake zone were running away from home. He believes that because animals are more keenly attuned to the Earth's magnetic field than humans, they react to magnetic changes that precede earthquakes. In early October 1989, Birkeland knew the Earth was under the influence of the highest tidal force in 3 years. He watched the classifieds closely.
So when I saw the 27 missing cat ads and the 58 missing dog ads, I called the Gilroy Dispatch and upgraded my prediction to a 6.5 to 7 magnitude, upgraded my probability to 85%, which is as high as I've ever gone, and was, first time in my life I was a little nervous about a quake.
Birkeland predicted the quake would hit sometime between the 14th and 21st of October. Few people took his claim seriously. Only a few days later, on October 17th, the Bay Area endured a devastating 15-second tremor. The so-called World Series earthquake caused an estimated $4 billion in damage. Birkeland is concerned that the next time San Franciscans might not be so lucky. So he continues to look for additional quake predictors.
All of the tidal forces are almost coincident.
He is now researching another possible earthquake indicator.
There it comes, here it comes, you see.
Geyser activities.
Up it comes, all right.
Called California's Old Faithful, this geyser in Calistoga goes off every 12 minutes. The geyser is so accurate, scientists installed equipment to record the exact time of each eruption.
And then occasionally you get a long gap between eruptions. This was
Birkeland thinks the eruptions might be influenced by the moon.
Christmas time, that was on
As the full moon travels overhead, its gravitational pull actually stretches the Earth's surface. The Earth's crust has to expand slightly to accommodate the strain, creating what are called Earth tides. Just as the moon causes the oceans to bulge, it does the same thing to the Earth's surface. Birkeland reasons that as this pressure builds to earthquake proportions, the stress widens fissures in the rock surrounding Old Faithful's underground reservoir.
The cracks are opened up more, which means more cold water seeps into the area around the geyser pool, and it cools the water, and it would take longer to cook it up until it erupts. If you've been monitoring a geyser over a period of months or years, you know what the background level is of gaps or intervals between eruptions. And then if you suddenly have an anomaly of 3 or 4 or 5 times greater, something is really up.
Birkeland contends that Old Faithful has helped him predict quakes many times. On January 2nd, 1999, one day after the full moon, he gets his payoff. The seismograph's needle begins to swing, indicating a small, localized tremor.
Now, I've been here a number of times, and I've never had an earthquake to order, but there it is.
Do the phases of the moon have any bearing on earthquakes? Do earth tides cause seismic activity?
In Southern California, we record about 20,000 earthquakes a year, so we have plenty of earthquakes to deal with to look and see whether those earthquakes are starting at the times when the tides are helping the earthquake to occur, and we cannot see any strong correlation between the tides and the earthquakes.
In the 1970s, the U.S. Geological Survey built an observatory to study earth tides. Data is still being collected at the Scripps Institute in San Diego.
What I'm standing in front of here is the record from an instrument we use to measure stretching in the earth, what we call strain. And what we're seeing here is the tides.
Earth tides are measured by a series of laser devices that are extremely accurate. However, despite Jim Birkeland's anecdotal evidence, no correlation has ever been found between earth tides and earthquakes.
It ought to be that tides cause earthquakes, or that earthquakes correlate with tides, that there are earthquakes at times of especially high tides, because tides are causing the earth to stretch. But it seems that that doesn't happen, and that must be telling us something about what is enough to cause rocks to fail.
Rocks fail, that is, they shatter along fault lines deep inside the Earth. This is the starting point of an earthquake, not on the surface of the Earth, where the earth tides occur.
In fact, where the earthquakes happen, at about 5 miles depth in the Earth, there's more than 1,000 tons of rock per square foot on top of them, so the pressures are enormous.
Another fact contradicting Birkeland's tide theory is that regardless of the moon phase, earthquakes happen every day in California. Despite this overwhelming evidence, Jim Birkeland persists in his research.
He has an interesting approach, but it's hard for me to give any credibility to those predictions. He's looking in a fairly roundabout way for an effect that we're studying quite directly. And with our direct study, we see no more than 1% or 2% change in the rate of earthquakes with the tides.
Though scientists strive to help us separate fact from fiction, they know it's a difficult task to dispel age-old myths. Next, historians uncover an ancient ritual performed under the silvery glow of the full moon, using deadly poisons. Some people are said to have transformed themselves from humans into werewolves.
The Unexplained will return on A&E. We now return to The Unexplained on A&E.
Of all the fascinating sights in the night sky, the most intriguing is the moon, with its power to transform its shape right before our eyes. It's little wonder that the moon has played such a big part in our myths. One of the ancient legends surrounding the full moon is that it can transform a man into a beast. called a werewolf. Preying on the innocent, the werewolf is said to attack its victims, tearing out their throats. In 16th and 17th century Europe, thousands of people were put on trial, tortured, and executed for being werewolves. One extraordinary trial from that period stands out from the rest. It's the story of a young man named Jean Grenier, who claimed to be a werewolf, and whose day in court would have historic implications. In 1603, Jean Grenier allegedly participated in a ritual to become a werewolf. Afterwards, he began a crime spree that included kidnapping, murder, and cannibalism. His tale unfolds in the south of France. Midsummer days are long, and the evenings balmy in that region. The full moon rises early, while the red sunset still tinges the sky. As the last light of day lingered, peasant children would steal a few moments of play after a long day's work, forgetting that darkness was only minutes away.
Jean Grenier was a young man. He was probably about 14, and in about the year 1603, he wandered into a field one day where some girls were tending sheep. And he was rather a disheveled-looking young man, very dark. His fingernails literally were black, and he looked like he hadn't been bathed or washed or fed properly in a very long time.
The girls described Grenier as having horrible fang-like teeth, an odd complexion, and a twisted, hunched stature. They said he peered out at them from under a tangle of brittle, reddish hair. When Grenier got too close, the girls became frightened and fled. In another incident, a young girl named Marguerite also encountered Grenier near the edge of the woods. He tried to grab her, but she fought and escaped. Soon after, Grenier was hunted down and arrested.
Jean Grenier was taken into custody, and he confessed readily that he had eaten any number of children, and that if he hadn't been scared off by one little girl who fought him, this young girl, Marguerite, he would have eaten her.
Grenier was accused of being a werewolf and brought before a French court. There was very little doubt that he would be found guilty and put to death. After all, it was widely accepted fact that the full moon was capable of transforming a man into a savage beast. Europeans believed this because such legends had been handed down from ancient times.
Lycanthropy, the technical word for werewolfery or shape-changing, goes back to an early mythological Greek king who tried to fool the great god Zeus by feeding him human flesh.
This breach of taboo was detected by Zeus. The Greek king, named Lycan, paid the ultimate price for his treachery. Zeus transformed him, giving him the head of a wolf. Just the word wolf was enough to strike terror into the hearts of Europeans from prehistory through medieval times.
Someone who becomes a lawbreaker, an outlaw, or a sociopath in these early cultures would be given what would be essentially considered a wolf.
To call someone a wolf's head meant that a person no longer had the rights of a man. He could be hunted down like a wolf.
If an outlaw was legally a wolf's head, children and other people probably believed he turned into a wolf out there in the forest. This is a very likely source for myths of werewolves.
During the time of Jean Grenier's werewolf trial in the early 1600s, there were rituals passed down through oral tradition. They claimed to have the power to turn man into a marauding beast. One such ritual was unearthed and transcribed by the folklorist W.R.S. Rolston in 1872. The recipe for creating a werewolf was quite explicit. First, one had to obtain a large cauldron, In it, a long list of ingredients were combined to make a magic potion. Some of the ingredients were deadly poisons: belladonna, arsenic, or strychnine. Under a full moon, the would-be werewolf would drink this toxic mixture and wait for the alchemy to take hold. The poisons, used in small enough quantities, would not kill, but they might have the effect of speeding up the heartbeat, dilating the eyes, as well as inducing severe muscle cramping, delirium, or hallucinations. The initiate would become convinced he had shed his human self and become a wolf.
Hail, great wolf spirit, make me a werewolf strong and bold, the terror of both young and old. Grant me a...
It was this very ritual that Jean Grenier, the 17th century murderer and cannibal, was believed to have followed. Next on The Unexplained, Grenier faces a fiery death at the stake if found guilty. His remarkable defense here on A&E.
We now return to The Unexplained on A&E.
In 1603, in the Les Landes region of France, an extraordinary trial was underway. A 14-year-old boy, accused of being a werewolf, was charged with killing and eating countless young victims. At the trial, he admitted performing a ritual to turn himself into a beast. He told the court of meeting a dark man in the woods. Under the full moon, the man had given him a wolf pelt to wear and a salve to rub on his skin, which Grenier claimed changed him into a werewolf. Grenier went on to give detailed descriptions of his crimes. He even claimed to have stolen a baby from its cradle. He confessed that all of his victims met the same horrible fate, First he killed them, then he ate them.
He'd leave virtually nothing left of them. And they would ask him why, because he said, I'm a wolf, I'm a werewolf.
The locations and circumstances Grenier provided in his confession coincided with the disappearances of young children in the town and its surrounding area.
There was no question that there were children who had been mutilated and killed. Of course, you would think, as in all of the hundreds of cases previous to Jean Grenier, he would have been summarily tortured and executed.
However, something unprecedented happened in that French courtroom. Court officials presented an argument we would all recognize today, that Grenier was himself a victim.
There was a remarkable, remarkable defense. And what happened is, the officials stood up and said, you know, something is terribly wrong here. This boy is not a werewolf. You can see this is the sign of a boy, a child who never had a proper upbringing. He had a father who was abusive. He was beaten, and he was left to wander the countryside to beg. It sounds so much in a way like our own times, where we say society in a way is responsible.
Grenier did not get the death sentence. Instead, he was incarcerated in a monastery in Bordeaux, where he died a few years later. The trauma Grenier had suffered as a child made complete rehabilitation impossible.
He was visited several years later, shortly before his death. He could barely recognize even the simplest suggestion. He could not even follow the simplest order or rule. He was stunted in growth. His appearance was dreadful. His fingernails remained black. He was totally disoriented. Today, clearly, we would call him psychotic.
The mercy of the French court had failed to save Grenier. But for the first time, there was a dramatic shift in attitude toward someone accused of being a werewolf. Grenier's trial helped the people of Les Landes step into the modern world, leaving behind age-old superstitions about werewolfery and the power of the moon. Jean Grenier may indeed have been mentally ill, but what caused his wolf-like appearance? Is there a scientific explanation for his abnormal and frightening physical characteristics? Dr. Ronald Socker, a hematologist at Georgetown University Hospital, read an account of the Grenier case and believes there was a biological cause for Grenier's condition, a disease called porphyria.
Porphyria is a disorder that is called an inborn error of metabolism. His behavior certainly is suspect, and of course his physical characteristics are compatible with porphyria.
An illness that creates too much red pigment in the bloodstream. Porphyria can lead to some startling physical characteristics. Dr. Socker says that most people with this abnormality actually lead normal lives. But Grenier suffered from a very rare and severe form of the disease.
Those are the ones that have dental abnormalities. They have strange hair color. He had this orange type hair, so they have pigment abnormalities.
The patient's skin actually has an aura of green or yellowish fluorescence in sunlight. The common name for this rare congenital disorder is the werewolf disease.
In the 1600s, perhaps 1700s, 1800s, and even into the 1900s, and perhaps even societies now in the 20th century that are uninformed, uneducated, if a person like this were in that community, they would be shunned.
Grenier, isolated and rejected, may have truly believed he had become a werewolf. Other side effects of his condition may have convinced him of this.
There are certain disorders that, or cravings that people have. I think one of the obvious cravings that we know about is children who are iron deficient have cravings to eat dirt and eat clay.
The disorder Grenier suffered from may have caused a strong craving for blood. People hospitalized for this condition today are given a blood derivative, hematin, to alleviate their symptoms, which can include sun sensitivity, muscle spasms, and severe abdominal pain. Dr. Socker believes this might explain Grenier's cannibalism.
Something motivated him, something perhaps very instinctive, to get blood or blood tissue which would alleviate some of the symptoms that he might have.
Though Grenier's condition would certainly not have been understood during his lifetime, he was not condemned to death for werewolfery. His life was spared by enlightened officials who viewed him not as a beast, but as a troubled man. Yet the myth of the moon's power to change man into predator still lives on in some modern minds. Next on The Unexplained, psychiatrists encounter people who believe themselves to be real-life werewolves. Do you believe the moon can affect human behavior? You tell us at A&E.com.
We now return to The Unexplained on A&E.
The werewolf legend has endured into the modern era. It frightens and delights each new generation with images of men transforming into savage beasts. Today, science has solved the puzzle of so-called werewolves, but the werewolf myth has also invaded the modern mind in disturbing ways. There is a psychiatric condition called lycanthropy. Its name derived from the ancient description of a werewolf. It is a mental condition in which a person believes he or she is becoming a wolf. These cases are extremely rare. In one 12-year study involving 5,000 psychiatric cases, only 2 patients were diagnosed as true lycanthropes. One of these cases was reported in the American Journal of Psychiatry in October of 1977. The article describes a 49-year-old suburban housewife in an unfulfilled marriage. She became obsessed with wolves, fantasizing about them by day and dreaming about them at night. She visited graveyards after dark and wandered for hours on end in the forest. She believed she was becoming a werewolf. The woman's mental state continued to deteriorate. At a family gathering, she tore off her clothes and got down on all fours and began growling like a wolf. The episode lasted 20 minutes. Her family was terrified. The following night, at home in bed, her husband said she began to growl and tear at the bedclothes with her teeth. The woman was soon admitted to a psychiatric hospital to be treated for lycanthropy.
She believed that she was a different species. That's typical of the general syndrome, where humans, who in fact, of course, remain humans, begin to behave in ways that they think these animals behave, which could include howling and growling.
The woman's belief that she was a werewolf was unshakable. During the early part of her hospitalization, she claimed that at night she turned into a wolf with claws and fangs. Then at daybreak, she became human again. When she looked into a mirror, she believed that the nightmare of being half human and half animal was reflected in her eyes. She told her doctors that one of her eyes looked frightened, while the other looked like the eye of a wolf that wanted to kill.
It's a kind of cognitive errors. They are thinking differently about themselves and the world than most people do. And if they have this misperception, then they would believe that they are falsely this particular kind of animal.
Under psychiatric care, she soon began to recover. However, near the completion of her treatment, the moon became full, and she had a relapse. She confessed to her doctors that she would keep on searching for what she lacked in her marriage, and she would haunt graveyards until she found a tall, dark, and hairy man. These rare lycanthropes may well be the modern-day incarnation of the werewolf, and their delusions can become deadly.
They've been known to murder, to torture people, and then cannibalize. So that can be a result, and the claim is that they believe that they're a werewolf and that this would be more appropriate behavior for a werewolf than for a human.
The behavior of these psychiatric patients seems to mirror the age-old myth. The sudden transformation under the moon may be a metaphor for the mental illness overtaking the individual. Why do we associate the moon with such destructive forces? What is it about the moon's haunting beauty that creates enduring myths such as that of the werewolf?
One of the most terrifying parts of the whole legend of lycanthropy is that it typically is described as someone who's a member of the community, not an outsider, not someone who just drifted in, but someone who has lived peacefully among the villagers, maybe a husband, a wife, a child, who suddenly becomes another entity and a dangerous, vicious enemy.
This ancient term werewolf might have been used to describe pathological human behavior that still exists today.
I believe that hundreds of years ago, there were such things as serial killers. It's just that they weren't called serial killers. I think that also, when we look at a particularly savage crime, we need to find a reason for it. And so we say, well, this individual was not human. The person who did this became an animal. The person who did this was as savage as a wolf.
Myths of the moon have filtered down to us through folklore and have been used by more primitive societies to explain rare diseases, psychotic behavior, and horrible acts of violence.
One of the main reasons why werewolf folklore and lunar folklore intersect is because the moon is a shapeshifter. As the moon moves across the sky, like no other heavenly body, it shifts its shape dramatically. This has been noticed by human beings going all the way back to probably before we were the species we are even.
Yet the myth of the moon's power endures. Many hold on to their belief in so-called moon madness. Fear of the uncontrollable whether in man or in nature, has plagued humankind since the beginning of time. Our ancestors looked outside themselves for explanation and comfort, to the gods, to superstition, to the skies.
Now we have a different and more scientific explanation for that, but in the olden days they didn't know, and they assumed the supernatural to explain. Now our perspectives are different.
While the moon's gravitational pull does raise tides, any other powers attributed to it are purely mythical. Science has worked to dispel these legends, yet attributing dark miracles to lunar forces seems to be an irresistible human need. I'm Bill Curtis. Join me again next time for another episode of The Unexplained, here on A&E.